We just basically witnessed a stabbing and almost died on the subway ourselves.
This week's video is going to be a little different. I was planning on doing a different video, but you may have seen on my social channels that something kind of crazy had happened to us, and there are a few things I wish I had known / things I wish I had been aware of while running from what we now know is an active gunman on the subway. I figured it could be helpful to tell the story time behind it so people can be aware of some of the things that have been happening, unfortunately very frequently, on public transportation these days, and also talk about certain things that we wish we had known beforehand that became clear after the fact, while also acknowledging that these situations are horrible and there's never a perfect thing to do. It's not like going through it made us experts whatsoever, but I do think just being able to relate to people, being able to talk about what happened is helpful for not only us too, but anyone else who has been through something similar. Obviously lots of trigger warnings for what we're about to talk about in this video, while also acknowledging that there are many crazier stories out there that have happened.
Yeah, like you said, we're not experts, but I kind of wish that I had a protocol in my mind of what to do in an emergency, because it kind of felt like every man for himself. So I think it's nice to have information out there on how to act in an emergency.
We're all running off of adrenaline. Whatever decisions you happen to make in these scenarios, can't really blame yourself for either. None of us really knew what was going on, which was the scariest part. So let's talk about exactly what happened to begin with. So we were on the subway. I take the subway all the time when I'm in New York.
I don't, because I don't live in New York.
We had ridden the subway a few times on this trip. We were taking the subway to all of our shows. The first night we went, everything was normal. The subway is never giving warm, fuzzy energy when you walk down there, but you're also there to be transported quickly somewhere for $2.90, which is now being raised to $3 in New York, and to the state of New York, if you are gonna raise it, please make it safer. Sometimes there are people singing, sometimes there are people fighting, sometimes there's lots going on, but that doesn't necessarily mean there's like a direct threat. On this particular day, we had sat down, one guy behind us was yelling. I've experienced that plenty of times. I was like, we're good, don't worry about it.
And he wasn't really yelling at anyone.
No.
Like, he was just kind of yelling at people in general, and what had happened was people kind of moved away from him, and he was kind of calling people out by what they were wearing. So even though Chris and I were probably sitting the closest to him, we didn't really want to move because like we just kind of wanted to be invisible.
And our backs were turned to him.
Yeah.
There's plenty of different layouts on the subway, and it was one of those where there are 3 seats and then 2 seats that face the 3 seats, and we were in the 2. And so we just thought, we're just gonna sit here. We only had about 5 stops we needed to ride. I was even making jokes to her. I was like, it's fine. But then some other guy on the other end of the car starts yelling back at him. And it appears that they know each other from something, but we're not really paying attention to the exact words that are being yelled, other than here and there, some violent threats being thrown in there, which again, sometimes that stuff happens, and I maybe naively don't worry about it as much as I should, because a lot of the time you hear things like that and nothing ends up actually happening, or you get off before something ends up happening. And so we were just sitting there and assuming like everything is gonna be okay. But then at one point, Kara says, should we get off? Because they really started yelling at each other, which, mind you, I'm not really looking at everything. I was probably looking at my phone for part of it. I was like, no, I think we'll be okay. We might as well not move cars, which at the end of the day, I'm glad we didn't move cars. Maybe we could have gotten off in that scenario, but more on that later. But the reason Kara said, should we get off, was
the other guy on the other side of the car, the one farthest from us, was yelling out some threats, and then from his bag, first he said, I'm gonna show you something, and then he took out what was a large kitchen knife out of his bag and kind of looked at the guy and then put the knife back. And that freaked me out. Like I said, we were like the ones closest to the guy, and we were trying to be invisible, so I didn't want to be like, he has a knife.
Yeah, but I also didn't know that she had seen a knife. I think it was like right after that stop, the train starts moving again, and the guy behind us has now gotten up, and that's when he slowly starts walking over to the guy that Kara had seen had a knife. And the guy who has a knife starts saying, don't come closer to me, but is backing away. And that is when suddenly everyone around his area on that end of the train starts getting up and running. And that's when adrenaline takes us over and we start getting up and running, and we dart towards the back of the train, which on the New York subways, there's doors at the end of each car with signs on them that says, do not cross cars while moving. But people do it all the time. You're not supposed to, except in an emergency. And so I've never done it while the cars were moving, but this was an emergency and I was the first to make it. But as I'm pulling, it's jammed or locked. I don't know, it's not moving. But at this point, there's about 40 people behind Kara and I yelling at me to open the door.
Yeah, because I don't think we would have attempted to open the door had there not been a huge crowd of people being like, open the door.
Stampeding towards us as well. And at this point, we don't know what's happening with the people fighting behind us. We just start hearing more and more screams. As the adrenaline keeps coursing through me, I eventually open it up. We see two different platforms, one like a few feet from the other, so you kind of have to almost jump between the two while the subway is moving like 50 miles per hour. I jump to the next one, but the second door is jammed. I think I must have like put my leg up and unjammed it because part of my calf has been sore ever since that day, but I don't remember anything that actually happened. So it must have just been an adrenaline rush of pulling it open. But now we've gotten into the next car, which the people in this car have no idea what's going on. All they see now is a stampede of like an entire subway car of people running through. We make it to the next one, but that door, there's a bunch of people in front of me who have now started running and they can't get it open and they say it's locked.
And what I know now is, so when we got into the next car, the people that were running from our car started yelling fight. But what the people in that car heard was fire.
Oh.
So that caused everyone to kind of get up and panic and start moving towards the front of the train.
We had now heard that someone was yelling that he had a gun because apparently the guy who was behind us, who was walking towards the other guy, did have a gun. There's a video of that on someone's Instagram story who had ended up being on the same subway car as us, but they were trapped behind where the fight was happening. At the end of the day, I'm glad that we didn't get off the car and go to one of the different cars because either way, we would have, one, had less information about what was going on, and two, we might have gotten trapped in a corner where the guy with the gun was rushing at people, which thankfully it doesn't seem like anyone ended up actually getting hurt from the whole thing. As we were running towards the next car after we had gotten through those two jammed doors, someone pulled the emergency brake, so everyone starts falling forward, and then we're all basically getting crushed near the end of that car where the door is supposedly locked, and everyone's pushing forward and we just hear screaming behind us while people are yelling to open the next door, but who's ever closest to the door is unable to open it. So that's when really panic just starts setting in because now we're trapped underground with nowhere to move. My adrenaline fight or flight response, thankfully, is to somehow be comforting to those around us, and we both did remain calm for the most part. I think the people who seemed to get the most scared were the people who had no idea what was going on. Thankfully, we had the smallest idea of what was going on, but we didn't know whether the guy who had pulled out the knife or the gun was just starting to go crazy and do as much damage as possible. So we had made it to the end. The people who are at the front are knocking on the front subway car, where those people are just sitting looking at a ton of people being crushed against the door because their door is locked as well, and they have no idea what's going on. They just know the subway stopped out of nowhere. So the conductor ends up coming through the front car, unlocking it, and everyone starts explaining what happened. We end up all moving into the next car and just waiting there for a bit. While we were running through that car was when the moment that happened where I made the TikTok of some girl saying, "You're Chris Olsen," while we were running through. It was just like kind of a fever dream of a 5 minutes or something like that. But we end up getting to the front. The conductor comes back through. The car goes to the next station. We were supposed to ride 2 stops, but we end up just getting off on that station, obviously. As soon as I leave the car, we're texting everyone what happened. And that's when I start basically having my trauma response of like shaking and crying because I had somehow held it together so far, but then we were finally out of the dangerous situation when we could let our adrenaline like leave our body. We later found out after I had posted the video from other people who were on the train and saw my video, all the other things that had happened and how the people on the other end of the fight were trapped in a corner because they couldn't open that door, and how they had seen that the guy had had a gun, and how people on the back end of the train were running that way, but the doors were, I guess, locked or jammed. I offered at one point when we were on the subway car where they couldn't get the door open for me to go ahead and try to open it because those first doors were really hard to get open. Things I would have done differently if I had ever been through something like that. When there feels like something might be wrong on the subway, we're gonna get off on the next stop.
Yeah.
We're gonna just get off. And we're not gonna move to another car. We're just gonna get off and maybe wait for the next train, because being a little late to a show, to wherever I'm going on the subway, is more worth it than having gone through all of that. That was just terrifying. In those situations, I know everyone is panicking, so it's really hard to decide exactly what you're gonna do, but I think pulling the emergency brake was a very tough decision for everyone involved. We are then trapped underground, and on the subway between stops, there's no phone signal. Someone commented on one of my videos, "Why didn't you call the cops?" 1, cops aren't gonna make it there fast enough for whatever was going on. And 2, there's no signal underground, so there was nothing to do there.
The term emergency brake feels very misleading because it seems like you should pull it in an emergency, but the only time you should really do that is if someone is stuck in the door. and if someone is going to get hurt,
Yeah,
the train
yeah.
continues moving. Because it really ended up hurting the situation, us being stuck down there.
Again, I don't blame the person who did that because I think it was a panic response. Had we been able to move to the next stop, as soon as the doors opened, everyone would have rushed out at that point. When I went through rehab when I was 19, the whole philosophy / method of that rehab was a lot of exposure therapy. Being exposed to some of the traumas, having to talk about all of the things that you've been through with your family. So I knew in the back of my head, because I live in New York, so taking the subway is almost a necessity for me. It's a necessity for a lot of New Yorkers, which is the thing. And a lot of New Yorkers unfortunately have a lot of traumatic experiences on there, and yet have to somehow find a way to once again take the most accessible form of transportation around the city. I decided to try to get back on the subway the next day and just ride at 2 stops, which I do think was helpful. A lot of people, when they were talking about traumatic things they had been through, whether it was a car crash or anything involving transportation, they had to get back on that mode of transportation and drive near where the crash happened or take the subway a few stops. And I do think it was helpful, but at the end of the day, everyone has very different responses. And there were a lot of people who said, just continue taking cabs because you can. But I think a lot of the time, there isn't a completely perfectly safe mode of transportation these days, especially in a city like New York, which I love New York. I will always be here. I'll always want to be a part of it. But on the first day of 2025, this was like one of 3 horrible things that happened that day. Everyone has a different trauma response. I think the best thing you can do is just try to be there for yourself and for anyone you are with. I kept saying afterwards, I was so glad we were with each other, because had either of us been alone, if I were on the train, I would have had my AirPods in and I would have had no idea what's going on. I would have just started running with everyone. And I think ultimately us knowing what was going on was a very, while scary, a very helpful part of the situation that helped us maintain some sort of sense of calm during it. The people who were the most scared were the people who had no idea what people had just run in for. Because at that point, your brain just goes to the worst case scenario. The things that this reminded me to do was be as aware of my surroundings as possible, no matter where I am, whether it's in New York or anywhere really, because the world continues to get scarier and scarier. But also try to not let the fear of what happened rule my life. Again, everyone reacts to things very differently. If I decided to not take the subway for as long as possible, then that would be okay as well. Being that I live here half of the time, I didn't want that to be the case, so I'm going to try to get back on and face the fear, but I'm gonna continue to be as aware of the surroundings as possible. I hope if you watch this, again, we are not experts on a situation now. We just had gone through something and both thought that if we had known of a situation like this, it may have helped us stay calm in a situation as well, even though all of these situations are different. But I just know sharing and relating about things surrounding trauma, as I learned in rehab, can be very helpful for people, including me. Also, part of the story that we didn't tell was we were going to see our friend Rachel Zegler and Romeo and Juliet that night. That's what we were on the train to go see. And there is no late seating for that show. So if you show up late, you can't go in. We got off the train with 10 minutes left to see the show. So in my video of me telling the story on social media, we are currently walking to the theater. We make it into the theater with 1 minute before showtime. We sit down and then the show begins. So we had no time to really discuss what had just happened. Unfortunately, which I told Rachel, we didn't really absorb what was happening for Act 1. I was a bit more present for Act 2, which you should go see her in the show. She is incredible. That was a bit of a crazy day. Maybe it was also a good thing for us to go and just immediately move on. Because
Art heals.
Art heals. A lot of people have told me in my comment section that playing Tetris after a really traumatic event is actually very helpful because it doesn't let your brain wire something as trauma. So maybe that was our version of playing Tetris. Thank you for watching. Back to regularly scheduled programming.